It's really simple, right? What goes up must come down. So how do we get the train up there to come down? Well, we use mechanics trained in wizardry. Everybody with me. Wingardium Leviosa.
Saying it wrong. It's Leviosa, not Leviosa.
Well, fine. I didn't want to do that anyway. Rides use what's called a lift hill to lift the train, which weighs 10 to 15 tons, into the air. So in today's episode, I want to talk about how they work. Let's get into it.
Now get ready. Here we go.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. If it's your first time here, I appreciate you being here. If you're returning, thank you so much for returning to watch another video. If you haven't already, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button down there. It helps the channel out, and I do appreciate it. Okay, so in this video, I wanted to cover 3 types, but honestly, they're going to be too big. So this video, I'm just going to cover type number 1, which is the chain lift hill. Other videos, I'll do cable lift hills and vertical lift hills. Also in this video, I am going to be talking a lot about lifts and lift components and some terminology, but you have to remember I can't talk about everything, and with lifts comes anti-rollbacks, so I'm going to briefly, ever so briefly, touch on some anti-rollbacks, but not much. I promise you I'm going to make another video, maybe even my next video, about anti-rollbacks. So don't worry, I will cover those in more detail, but for this video, when I mention anti-rollbacks or ARBs, it's simply just going to be a very short little snippet of information. One of the things I'm not going to be covering is accelerated hills, which would be kind of close to an element. So when rides like, I believe it's Maverick out there at Cedar Point that accelerate the train up the lift hill, it is a lift hill, but it's accelerated. It's more of like an element at that point in time. Okay, so let's jump right into the anatomy of a chain lift hill. Chain lift hills are the simpler of the options out there. They're widespread, they're easy to use, they're economical. They have lots of wear and tear components in them, but most ride manufacturers tend to stick with chain lifts on these things. So what's the first major component of a chain lift? Well, it's the chain itself. We're going to start at the chain. So the chain is what does all the work in the center. The chain is made up of individual components all put together, which are called links. So you have a chain link, and you start taking multiple links and putting them together one right after the other until those links come all the way back around and join to themselves again, and all those links put together are called a chain. Of the links, you have typically one style used for amusement rides. It's basically a roller chain. And when I say roller chain, what I'm referring to is in between the links, there is a barrel that the chain dog latches onto, and that's what actually lifts the train up. So those links on a lot of older chains were just fixed steel shafts. And what they would do is they would just rotate with the chain. So it causes a little bit of extra wear in the componentry in there. The chain dogs will wear down a little bit more than usual. You have to keep them extra oily. So what they would do is they would put a sleeve around that steel pin with a bearing surface on the inside. And that sleeve would rotate free of the actual link itself. So you can grab that center piece of the chain link and just rotate it. And those are called roller chains because the friction and wear on those things is much less than the older solid link chains. So that is pretty much the main style used on all amusement park rides. In that, there is a style of chain, 2 different types used. There is a S-link and a straight link. So straight link is when you look at the chain straight on, the links are parallel with each other. They're parallel bars. Perfect straight line. And then on the inside, when they join up to the next one, you'll have one link like this, and the next one goes to the inside, and then the next one goes to the outside, like that. And it ladders all the way up with the barrels in between. S-links, what they do is they're actually curved like this. So you have one link shaped like that, and then the other link is shaped like this. And it looks kind of like a lazy S. It's more of like a dog leg in there. but those are called S-link chains. Now, the reason to use a straight link chain over an S-link chain, well, straight link chains can wear much less, and by wear, we talk about pitch. Let's talk about pitch for a second. So the pitch of the chain is the rollers in between, how far apart those rollers are. That is your pitch. So if I built a chain where each one of those rollers was, we'll use imperial, we'll just say 6 inches on center, and say, okay, that is a 6-inch pitch chain. That's pretty much the way chains are measured. So when you talk about stretch, all those moving components constantly doing this on the lift hill, they produce wear, and the components start to slide further and further and further apart. So as they slide further apart, your chain gets longer. Eventually it'll become long enough to where you need to remove one of the chain links to tighten it back together to make it the original size again. So one of the advantages of straight link chain is that they can lift a little bit more weight because they're solid, but the numbers are really, it's mathematical. The difference is minor, honestly. So they can lift a little bit more weight, but the deal is that there is hardly any stretch to them because it's simply just the wear of the mechanical components along the way that causes the stretch. When you talk about an S-link chain, S-link chains are quite unique because they have multiple characteristics to them. They wear more, but the actual steel itself, the bearing surfaces don't actually wear much more than a straight link chain does. What actually happens is that S-link chains are typically used in applications where the train lands on the lift hill much harder. And those S-links all kind of give like this. And what that give does is it turns the chain essentially into a giant rubber band. So the chain's allowed to go whoop and then come back. So that's a very unique function. So you'll see S-link chains a lot of times on things that have very heavy trains, or you have trains that land on lift hills like a boomerang. Boomerangs on the lift 2 is typically an S-link chain up there. So you have much more of a shock absorption to those rides. So they can absorb a lot of shock as opposed to a straight link chain cannot absorb shock at all. It has to be fed the train very precisely at a very precise rate to keep the shock load down on that thing. So there's your two main differences between the S and the straight link chain. Now, along wear, how do we measure wear on the chain? It's actually very simple. We have the chain measurement brand new from the manufacturer, and we measure across a number of links. The more links you sample, the greater your wear becomes. So the manufacturer typically defines this in somewhat of a usable measurement. So they say, like I was used to working with, about 20 links. They say measure the center of the barrel to the center of the barrel on 20 links. And it should be at 2,000 millimeters. There we go. Brand new, the chain is 2,000 millimeters over 20 links. Okay. And then they say you need to replace the chain once the wear gets to 2,224. So it's like, okay, now you know to replace the chain at that point in time. A lot of times we have the manufacturer or manufacturer's representative of that chain company come in during the off season to inspect the chain. And now they're not getting in there nitty-gritty and thoroughly pulling the thing apart. They are simply just looking at their product sitting in there, knowing what they know because they built the thing. They're much more useful when looking at those components than we are. So they know to look in there and they say, okay, yeah, we see this, we see that. No, your chain's good. A lot of times manufacturers stipulate, hey, every 5 to 10 years you need to replace your chain depending on the wear. And most of the time we've come up on that 5-year mark and the manufacturers come out and they say, your guys' chain looks like brand new. There's no need to replace this thing at all. It's like, oh, okay, great. We could only take that so far because we have the manufacturer stating, hey, it's great. But then you might have an insurance company stating, well, the manufacturer says 5 years, you need to replace it 5 years. And then you might have to jump through a bunch of engineering loopholes to try to get that extended out past 5 years, and it might not be worth it to the park. It might just be like, okay, bite the bullet, buy a new chain. Next, we'll talk about the chain dog. The chain dog is what's underneath the train that you're riding on typically. And that guy is the one, it's also called a ratchet. It could be called lots of different things, but most of the time when you're talking about chain dogs and anti-rollbacks, they're typically referred to as a dog. That's just the terminology that's used. But that dog sits there underneath the train. It can go up and down nice and free. And basically as it comes up to those links like this, the dog comes across it, goes up, and then falls back down. And then the train rolls back a little bit, and then the chain is free to push it up the lift hill at that point once the dog bites in. Dogs are typically positive engagement devices, which means that when it bites onto that chain, the more pressure you push on it, the harder it wants to try to pull itself down into the assembly. So it's not something that, like, if you push too hard, it simply just comes undone and flops out. It's like, that's typically not a thing, unless you've had some sort of catastrophic failure, which isn't good. But yeah, so chain dogs are positive engagement devices that ride on the train. There's typically at least 2 of them on the majority of rides. Some only have 1, but you're talking smaller coaches, like one little tiny coach. Mad Mouse style ride, a lot of times they have 1 chain dog. Next, we'll move into more of the structure, and we'll say, what is this chain riding on the inside? Well, the chain rides on a slide plate. That's a lot of times what the manufacturer calls that. It's called a slide plate, but realistically, people think of like, oh, you think of steel and this big steel plate that the thing slides on. It's actually plastic. So in the amusement industries, we use a lot of high density plastic that's called UHMW, and it's just an acronym. It's short for ultra high molecular weight plastic, UHMW. So the UHMW is stuff that is extremely durable, and it can take an enormous amount of pressure. So this is literally about a 20 millimeter thick piece of plastic that sits underneath the chain all the way up the lift hill. And it's just a flat piece of plastic. Some manufacturers have gone to the extra detail to mold the plastic into a shape kind of like a trough that kind of holds the chain steady and guides it in the center. But realistically, once you stretch a chain from point A to point B, it doesn't really wander in the center too much, so there's really not much need to do that. US Sabaki came up with a form of chain liner, which is really cool stuff. I never personally used it because we never had the money to put it into a ride. They came up with this stuff, and I'm sure every manufacturer probably has it now because it was super cool when they came out with it, and then if everyone liked it, they're like, oh, we're just going to copy it. Sure they did. It's green, which you would think, it's like, okay, why does the color matter? Most of chain liner I've ever used actually is black, just because it's greasy. it's an aesthetics thing. It's like, yeah, just let it blend in down there with everything else. People don't pay attention to it. But there's this green, and it's really cool. It's got about 10, 12 millimeters of green, and then underneath it is red. There's a layer of red underneath the thing. So as your chain wears down into the liner, you could actually look at the head sprocket up on top, and you can actually look up there and just know that if you see red plastic up there, you have worn down chain liner somewhere. Which, by the way, on the majority of these rides, we'll get into terminology in a little bit later, the crown of the lift hill at the very top, that crown of the lift hill is where the chain liner wears the most. Most of the time, if you have chain liner that needs replacing, you typically have to do it on the crown. That's where it is. You break the chain apart, roll it back both directions, and you get up there and unbolt the plastic. It's only held in one direction, so when you put a piece of chain liner down, it typically has 2 screws at the bottom and then nothing at the top. It's free at the top. And the reason for that is expansion and contraction on that plastic is so great that if you anchor it on both sides, it turns into a spaghetti. It just turns into a wavy line when it heats up. It can't go anywhere. Some manufacturers have gone to the great detail of putting a slot in the top. So you have a single hole or two holes down at the bottom maybe, or a single hole in the bottom which is anchoring it. And then at the top there's actually a slot with the fastener in the center. And that allows it to maintain the liner in one spot, but then a liner is also allowed to expand and contract in that slot, so it's allowed to go where it wants to, which is a really cool feature. But a lot of manufacturers simply just, they dovetail the edge like that, and they anchor the bottom at the base, and then they put the next piece up, and they go right on top of there. Most rides keep chain liner sections into about between, most are metric, so I say between 1 and 3 meters long. Those are your standard lengths of chain liner in most rides. So when you look at chain troughs and stuff and you see a lot of little hardware sticking out all over the place, that is the liner being held down on the inside. Inverted coasters, they have 2 sets of chain liners. So like on an inverted coaster, you will have the chain liner that the chain wears on as the train passes by. That's the big slide plate I'm talking about. But then underneath, which is facing the ground in this case on an inverted coaster, you have 2 smaller strips of chain liner that the chain simply just rests on as it's sitting idle going along. So that chain liner is just sitting there on the bottom and laying on the 2 sides of the links. Remember, the center has to be open to allow the chain dog to pass by. So you have those 2 liners on the bottom, and then when the chain dog does come by, it lifts the chain up and pushes it on the chain liner on the top. The chain trough itself is a piece of, it's typically rectangular tubing like that, or rectangular steel tubing, and then they've opened the top of it up. So it looks about like that. So kind of like a big C channel with lips laid on its side. This is dual purpose. Most channels look like this. Some of them are simply just open, where there's nothing on top of them like that. There's 2 reasons for this. The chain, if you look on these guys, you only see the barrel in the center, and that's because if the chain were to try to lift for some reason, these little edges hold the chain down. Now, some manufacturers, the one that comes to mind right off the top of my head is like Expedition Everest. That's a pretty iconic one. As you see the chain going up there, it's an open trough like that. But every once in a while, you see these little clips welded onto the side of it as a chain passes by. Well, those are hold downs, so that if the chain were to break and the chain tries to slide back down the chain trough, basically the hold downs keep the chain inside the trough. So what you would be dealing with is if I broke the chain at the top, right at one of those hold downs or just past a hold down, the chain were to start sliding backwards, it starts to bunch up. The chain bunches up in one spot right before a hold down. And then if the chain continues to slide, it'll basically go right down to that point and catch, and it stays in the trough. Your worst case scenario, honestly, is if a chain were to break at the top, slide, and then for some reason, I don't know how this would happen. This is like some Final Destination stuff right here. But for some reason, the chain were to lift at the top and start to curl on itself, it would basically become a snowball as it came back down the lift hill. But at the same time, even in that Final Destination scenario, it would probably get up to a certain size, maybe about a meter in diameter, 1.5 meters, and then its own weight would probably just fall over to one side, and then it might try to pull the chain up and out like a slinky at that point. That would be really odd to see, but the purpose of those troughs on the side and those metal clips on the side are to hold the chain down in the event that the thing breaks. Sprockets. Let's talk about sprockets real quick. The term sprocket is used pretty interchangeably. They're all sprockets, essentially. You can use different terms for them. You can call it an idler sprocket. You can call it a drive sprocket. There's typically terms that the manufacturers use on these things that are a little more robust for the industry. So at the very bottom of the lift hill, right as you come up to the lift, the last sprocket that chain went around, That sprocket down there is called the tail. That's the tail sprocket. That's the first one you pass on the lift hill. As you go up the lift hill, on woodies, they're typically right there. You can see them. On most steel roller coasters, they're down below the track and you can't see them. But that's the tail sprocket, and it goes up and over the top. And it goes over the top, and then it gets to the head sprocket. The head sprocket sits up there, and that's the part where the chain returns, and it starts to come down and underneath the ride. By the way, the underside of the lift hill also has chain liner on it as well. Anything the chain touches has a plastic liner to it. So then you go down the lift hill, and this is, I'll go over something like a B&M ride first. So you go down the lift hill, and then the first sprocket it meets down there is the one that the lift motor is turning. So the one that the lift motor turns is called the bull wheel. That's just a term that they gave to it. So the chain comes down, it goes over the bull wheel, and then it goes up and over some more sprockets on the inside until it gets to a tensioner sprocket. The tensioner sprocket is what pulls weight down on the entire assembly to keep the chain tight. Again, these are all terms, they're interchangeable, and it depends on how the manufacturer has set the ride up. So inverts are slightly different than regular standard roller coasters. I could take a B&M roller coaster where you have a tail sprocket, a tensioner, an idler, a bull sprocket, and a head sprocket up at the top. And in B&Ms, you could pretty much just invert the track, and that's the exact same as an inverted. But for like some Vekoma rides, like I dealt with an SLC. An SLC has a return sprocket down at the bottom, or the tail sprocket down there, which, by the way, that is not actually a sprocket. That's on an SLC, that's just a round wheel with UHMW lining it. There is no actual teeth on that. It's flat. It lets the chain slide. So you can grab that wheel and stop it midway through, and the chain will just continue to slide right over it. Interesting, but yeah, they didn't use a sprocket down there. But at the top, the very top, that's where on the SLC they've put their motor. So at the very top, there's the bull wheel up there. So if you see at the top of a ride that there's a lift motor up there, that's the bull wheel. And then you have the tail sprocket, and on the SLCs, the tail sprocket was also the tensioner sprocket. So there was only two on that ride. As opposed to the B&M I worked on, it had 1, 2, 3, 4. So we'll move on now to lift motors. Lift motors is what does all the lifting in the ride. They typically, on a lot of newer rides, they use very large DC lift motors. And the DC is used for two reasons. Mainly, it's used because you can get a very high torque out of the motor, which is what lift hills need. They need a lot of torque. And you can also drive the thing very precisely. So AC motors, you kind of have to give them a running start at it. You have to have a delta Y or something like that to start the motor up. And they just go pretty much from 0 to 100. The older ones did right off the bat. Newer AC motors are becoming much, much better. So you're starting to see them pop up on a lot of rides because they're much more economical than a DC motor is. So you use a really, really big AC motor, but then you can put a frequency drive on that and slow the motor down to slow the lift down and speed it up as you want to. But the older style AC motors, they weren't rated to do that really. So if you wanted to say, oh, here's the motor's full RPM package, and we don't want the train going that fast up the lift hill. The faster the lift hill moves, the faster you tear up stuff easily. So you want to slow the lift hill down to keep the wear and tear low. So what you do is you say, okay, we can put an AC drive on it and slow that motor down and slow the RPM down. Most of the time what that does is that burns the AC motor out really fast. So newer motors are wound with those in mind, and they're much stronger internally. So we started off with AC, had all these problems with it. The industry switched to DC. These were great motors, high torque, everything. They're more expensive to buy. They're more expensive to repair. And then we started building better AC frequency drive motors. So there's kind of now this balance between whether a motor is AC or DC. Most manufacturers still go with DC simply because they're small. When you compare it to an AC motor, DC motors are pretty small, and you could fit them in a lot of places. AC motors are really big when you talk about a motor that can create 200 horsepower necessary to turn the lift hill. So that motor latches onto a gearbox. That gearbox is a very big reduction gearbox. It turns at 1700 RPM into about 60 RPM, 70 RPM, somewhere right around there on the other side. And that guy is attached to the bull wheel. Fun fact on B&Ms, the gearbox is attached to another gearbox. kind of a fun quirk there, simply because on the lift hill, those sprockets where it goes over the bull wheel past an idler and then past a tensioner and then back up, those sprockets inside there are actually classified as a gearbox. So B&M calls that the gearbox. That's the lift gearbox down there. So you have a gearbox attached to a gearbox attached to a lift motor for a B&M. A lot of ride manufacturers don't necessarily call it that. They just say, well, those are the chain sprockets down there. Yeah, bull, idler, and then on the B&Ms, the tail is also the tensioner that pulls tension on the chain. And let's talk about tension real quick. Tension on the chain is necessary because that bull sprocket down there is trying as hard as it can to pull that chain and turn that chain. So they wrap the chain around that bull sprocket as much as they can. That's why you typically see chains go into the bull sprocket and it makes a 180-degree turn, because that's pretty much as tight as you can make it. You could go slightly over, but then you start to run into clearance problems on the other side because you have to stack sprockets one on top of each other to go this way and then come back that way. Doable, but a lot of times they turn them at least 180 degrees. So when you're putting that much torque into that big chain, when you're putting that much torque inside that thing, that bull sprocket wants to jump. It wants to skip a tooth. That's the term. It's called skipping a tooth. So it wants to skip a tooth and jump out of there and try to rotate. If you've ever heard the sound before on a lift hill, it's an extremely nasty, bad sound. It tears up stuff. It's a horrible thing. So no skipping. So what we do is we wrap it around that bull wheel as best we can, and then we wrap it around some other stuff, like a B&M, it wraps around an idler and then comes back to the tensioner. The tensioner takes the entire chain and pulls it really tight and holds it really tight. That way, not only is it have that 180-degree turnaround on that bull wheel down there, but it now has tension pulled across it, so it has little chance to slip. There was a carnival ride I made a video on a little while back where the chain broke on the lift hill, and right before that chain broke, you heard the chain it went up, and then the ride looked like it slowed for a second, and then the ride went and then it rolled backwards. Well, that sound that ride made, that was the sound of the bull wheel skipping tooth. It was skipping teeth up there because the chain had started to stretch, because right before the chain breaks, it stretches because that's the links physically going boink and coming apart like a rubber band. So as the chain was breaking and stretching apart, the bull wheel had lost its tension. So once it lost its tension, it was just all that torque had to go somewhere, so it just broke free of the chain and just started spinning. So it went, and then the chain rolled backwards and the train rolled backwards. Unfortunately, that one snapped the hitch off of Coach 1 too, which was, that wasn't great either. Along the lines of chain tensioners, there is not always a spring pulling that chain back. Most of the time it's done by weight. You use a very large weight to simply pull on that tensioner sprocket backwards, back down. And then some rides use a spring. They use spring tension. The SLC used giant springs to push the idler sprocket or the tail sprocket backwards to create tension. And some rides don't use any but the chain's weight. So this is actually done on old Woodies. The tail sprocket would be lifted up off the ground a lot, and the sprockets further back in would be much lower. And so as the sprockets came out, the chain would curve up to that tail sprocket. Well, how far back that curve went and made a slope, that slope is actually weight of the chain. And that weight off the ground is actually tensioning the entire mechanism. It's not the best, but it was done all over the place. It was also done on water rides too. Water rides don't have chain tensioners on them typically because they're very unique rides. So what they do is they bring the chain off the bottom side of the lift hill and they just let all that chain and wood just droop underneath the thing and create this big sag. That big sag is the tensioning mechanism for the lift hill. At this point in the video, if you haven't already, please make sure you like and subscribe and give me some comments down there. Let me know if you got any fun stories to add on to these. And then let me know if you want to see something for topics in the future too. I'm always up for new stuff. I've got a list of things that I'm making, but sometimes somebody says something and I'm like, oh yeah, let's do that one real quick. That really sounds like fun. I do enjoy getting that information. You guys come up with a lot of good ideas for videos, so let me know if you got them. You can also email me at ryantheridermechanic@yahoo.com. Let's get back into the video. On those older lift motors, like an AC drive, you find this a lot on wood roller coasters that still just used the lift motor is on or off. There is no slow speed to it. They understood that once you land a train on top of there and stop the lift, which happens all the time, they had to restart that assembly. Well, an AC motor that doesn't have a high torque to start off can't push that train over. The motor just locks up. It sits there and hums. I know. I've seen it. It just sits there and hums and gets really hot really fast. So what they do is they put this giant, looks like a UFO, metal, aluminum, donut-looking thing in between the lift motor and the gearbox, and that thing has fluid on the inside, and that thing's called a fluid coupler. The fluid coupler is basically on the inside of that donut. There's a lot of veins very close to each other. They're just like fingers that sit right next to each other like that with an air gap in between them. And then there's fluid inside of there, like a transmission fluid, a very light viscosity type fluid. And then what happens is as the motor picks up, the two halves turn independently of each other internally. As the motor picks up its RPM, those fingers try to take that fluid and sling it to the outside. Well, the channels get bigger to the outside as they go because they're shaped like a pie. So they get bigger to the outside as they go, and what happens is that creates hydraulic force further out. And that force has to go somewhere, so it goes back into that gap in the center. But the gap is extremely tight all the way around. So that force doesn't really have anywhere to go. So it ends up hitting the other side. And then as the two fingers pass each other, it creates a lot of tension, almost a hydraulic lock. It creates a lot of tension as it goes by on the other side. And as those fingers continue to do that, basically as the motor starts speeding up, the other side that's connected to the gearbox starts to turn because of that hydraulic force. And then it keeps doing that more and more until eventually side A is going the same speed as side B. Now, those are called hydraulic fluid couplings or fluid couplings. So those are used in lots of stuff, but they're used also in lift hills on older rides with AC motors to smooth out the starting process with a load, or i.e. a train, on the lift hill. So in those rides you have the motor, then a fluid coupling, then the gearbox, then the chain system, and it comes back. We can't talk about this stuff without starting to talk about anti-rollbacks. So here's the, it's kind of touchy here and there, so I'll kind of get into it a little bit now and some later too. But the first thing ride manufacturers do to prevent an anti-rollback, or to make the train so it doesn't roll back, is they actually stop the chain before the actual anti-rollbacks even come into play. So those completely out of the picture right now. I'm talking about the chain itself. A lot of manufacturers put a one-way clutch or a Sprag on the lift hill to prevent the chain itself from rotating backwards. So you can literally take some of these rides. I know B&Ms do this, so I'll use them as an example. And you can literally lift all the anti-rollbacks up into the train and stick them there. Put the train on the lift and stop, and that train will just stop right there, and it will not go anywhere, even though the motor doesn't have a brake on it, because the Sprag is locked at that point in time. It's preventing the chain from rolling backwards. Some ride manufacturers use a DC motor with a brake. The SLC I worked on, it had a brake on the back of the lift motor. So it didn't have a Sprag to prevent it from turning backwards, but as soon as a lift motor stopped for any reason, you took power away from it, the brake applied and it locked that motor up. The train couldn't go anywhere. Again, this was independent of all the anti-rollbacks on the train. This was simply just the chain itself had its own system of anti-rollback on it. This was, again, one of those things, you've probably heard me talk about this before. The brake on the back of the motors, they're not extremely powerful. They're powerful, but they're not extremely powerful. But when you put that through a planetary drive gearbox or a big gearbox reduction, those brakes are massive on the other side, and they could easily hold a train at very sharp angles as well. Now, I'll talk about the anti-rollback rail itself on the ride, which is what we're typically used to seeing out there next to the chain. It's that metal rail that sits alongside. Some rides have two of them. Though that's the anti-rollback rail. A lot of manufacturers refer to it as the anti-rollback rail. Some call it a toothed rail. Just depends on how you want to reference it. But that is the anti-rollback rail that's next to the ride. That's what the anti-rollback cams or anti-rollback dogs latch into to actually put the motion back into the structure. Fun thing on B&Ms, the non-inverted B&Ms, that whole anti-rollback rail is just sitting there. It's got two bolts, one at the top, one at the bottom, that are on plates, but there's actually a buffer in between the two that's rubber, so that not only when the train bites into it, it stops, but it actually is allowed to compress just slightly. If you've seen my episode on grease, then you've already know where I'm going with the next one, but then a lot of lift hills use oiling mechanisms called automatic oilers. They sit there and they pump oil onto the chain at predetermined times from typically all angles, and they make that chain nice and oily. Are all rides required to have them to oil the chain? Because oil is completely necessary to keep this running. But are they required to have them? No, they're not. Is it a nice thing? Yes, it's a nice thing. But you can always send a mechanic out there and oil the chain manually. Our SLC had an automatic oiler. It was broken down before I ever started working there. Honestly, the entire time there, we never fixed it back up because it was never the park didn't want to. And I know a lot of people are like, why wouldn't you do that? Blah, 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 and save so much time and all. I understand, but the park, before I got there, the park got used to just going, hey, on the weekly or sooner, depending on weather conditions and stuff like that, on the weekly, we're just going to go out there, and I would do it. I would go up, I would start the lift hill, and I'd walk up to the top of the lift hill, and I would take about 1.5 quarts of motor oil, 30 weight oil, and I would drizzle it onto the chain from the top, evenly on both sides. I just drizzle it right onto there, and then I would let that go down, and basically as it was going down, that motor oil would seep through the chain into the rotating surfaces onto the other side, and it would just get everywhere. And then I would go down and actually do it at the bottom too, because I would oil the bottom to do the same thing. So when it came back the other side, it would go from the other direction back down. And it was only about once a week that was necessary, unless we had lots of rain or moisture or something to wipe that off. So, I mean, the entire time I worked there, we had never fixed that auto oiler. But honestly, we didn't miss a thing. The auto oiler on the B&M ride, we had more troubles with it. We spent a lot more money keeping it running. Its breakdowns were also very few and far between. It's not like it was a everyday occurrence there either. Terms, we're going to talk about the lift hill. That is the entire structure that the lift hill makes. So the lift hill is the thing that parks like to see because that defines their skyline. A lot of parks talk about their skyline. Oh, our skyline. Because when you say our skyline, basically if you think about your park, your home park, whatever it is, if you looked back from, let's say, a quarter mile away, and as the sun's setting, where you can't see that definition of all the exact stuff that's happening, you could picture a tree line or something like that, and you can picture your big lift hills coming up and out, the big iconic loop that you see. If you're at Alton Towers, you're just gonna see trees. But you know, most parks, you can see these big iconic structures coming up out of there, and that defines the park's skyline. So lift hills make the skyline, even though there's lots of other things that stick up there too. Parks like to say, okay, that lift hill is part of our skyline. There are iconic rides out there that when you see the lift hill, you know what it is. It's like if you see that big lift, oh, it's like, phew, I know what that one is. You can spot that from miles away. I can look out on a clear day and I could see that. I remember, fun story, on the lift hill of the ride I was working at in Northern California, on a clear day when it was nice and sunny, you can go up to the top of the lift hill, even though ours weren't that high, 150 feet. You can go up to the top of the lift hill. If you knew where to look and you looked just right out there between the hills, you could actually see the Golden Gate Bridge. And that was really far away, so that was fun. Someone told me that. I was like, what? And then one day, or a couple of days, I looked for it, couldn't see it. But then one day I looked out and I saw the two spars from the Golden Gate sticking up out there. And I was like, wow, you can see that. That's amazing. So the lift hill is the entire structure. So we'll start at the bottom, work our way up. The bottom of the lift hill is called the lift base. The lift base is typically what you refer to as the access point. This is the lowest spot on the ride. If you send a train onto a dead lift and it just stops there and you have to evacuate from it, you would use the term we had to evacuate from the lift base. The base is where all the mechanical work is typically. It's where the train stops if the lift died. So you have lift base, and then just like that, halfway up, you have what's the mid-lift. The mid-lift is simply just that. It is the middle of the lift. There is nothing going on there. It is the most boring part of the ride. There is just nothing happening, nothing but chain and liner and rail. That's it. You have lift park. Now, lift park is a controls term, actually, because lift park, there's nothing defining lift park except for some proximity sensors. At the very top of the lift hill, as you're going up there, before you go over, you're still on the graded surface. You come across these sensors in the track, and that is lift park. That is what is the edge of your block zone. So as you're going up, if you've ever been on a lift hill where you go all the way up to the top and then suddenly it stops, that's because you've reached lift park, and the PLC, Programmable Logic Controller, says that the zone ahead of you is still occupied by a train. So it is going to hold you at lift park. Now, on a lot of rides, this is not an automatic process to restart the lift. It's a manual process that has to be done. So on a lot of rides, you have to have maintenance come out, or maybe operations has a certain set of procedures to basically go back and restart the lift hill to get you back and going again. Just past lift park is called lift crown. That is the crown of the lift. That's the very top. It's the top of the ride as it crowns over. Like I said earlier, that's the point that you're going to have all the wear on your chain liner. That's where everything happens up there. And then after that crown, there's pretty much nothing there. Most rides, or a lot of rides, go straight into a drop. If you're a B&M, you do that little landing right there as it levels out. So let's talk about that area real quick while I'm on B&Ms and that little landing right there. Most of the time, the head sprocket is pushed further down the lift than it needs to be. So as you crown, the train starts to roll on its own. Once it passes the center line, it starts to roll on its own. And then what happens a lot of times on the B&M is that the chain dog comes out of the chain as it starts to come off of that area right there. That is not that lifting up doesn't pull the chain dog out of the chain. It's simply just free from that point in time. And a lot of times what they do is they level the track out right there. I've never got an official explanation on this, but just the mechanics itself. This is my guess. That's all this is. I'm guessing that they leveled the track out right there because as they were able to level that out right there, the second chain dog that's further back in the train is able to continue to just go clunk, clunk, clunk because the train doesn't speed up that fast. So you've actually saved wear and tear on that chain dog. Is that necessary? No, it's not. It's a nice thing. Plenty of rides just go straight over that, and you hear those chain dogs really start thumping hard as they go over there. The same thing, I say chain dog going over those links, but you're also doing the same thing with your anti-rollbacks, right? They're sitting back there going, well, if you start speeding your train up, and they get really fast, and they start doing lots of wear and tear and damage on the inside. So it's best to control your train over that lift as slow as possible for the wear and tear on the components. Last term is, I've made a video on this before. It was one of my very early videos, so it wasn't great, but that's neither here nor there. The last term that I want to go over is called making the lift. And no, I'm not referring to when they built the lift. So making the lift is when you dispatch a train and it goes out of the station. A lot of rides have that fun little dip down right before you get to the lift hill. So it's B&Ms, a lot of times they come out of the station, they make a dip down as they go. Old arrows used to do the same thing. They'd have this dip and a little flat spot, and then they would go up on the lift. Well, that is to put train inertia into the train so it can make the lift, because what happens is that your lift hill is sitting flat like this. Well, the chain on a lot of rides, not all of them, goes straight. So the track comes like this, and then it just curves up at the end. So realistically, that curve, let's see if I can get this right, that curve like this, right here is where the chain dog has to engage. But the track is coming from down here where my arm is. So you have to get, and the chain dog a lot of time is mounted mid-train. They're midway through, around the middle of the train right there. That's around where the two chain dogs are. They typically have a coach or two separating them. But that 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 coaches back has to get up the track to that point on the lift before it can actually catch. So you have to give it a shove of speed out there and get it going fast in order to get it to go, 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 and suddenly go whoop and land and actually catch the lift. And that's called making the lift. Older coasters, if they didn't get out of the station fast for some reason, they let their hands off the dispatch buttons and it slowed down, they would come up, 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 and they would come right to that point and then either roll backwards or they would just sit there because maybe the anti-rollback's engaged, but the chain dog didn't. So it would just sit at lift base. I know at RMC, we did that a bunch of times because the kids would let their hands off the buttons as the train was going out, but not all the way out, and it would slow the train down enough to where it went up, and the anti-rollbacks bit in, and they held the train, but the chain dog did not. I kid you not, I went out to that RMC one time, and the chain was here. I should say like the link was here like this, and the dog was sitting here like a 1/4 inch away. Now, you say a 1/4 inch, couldn't you just push it? Well, you got to remember that the two lift is this way and the track is sloping like this. So even though it was just a 1/4 inch away from that link, it actually had to be, you know, if we look at it like this, it actually had to be down here. So actually, it was more like 3 inches away. And 3 inches away on the track would have meant that the train had to get pushed up about another 10 feet to get that last 3 inches in there. But yeah, that term is called making the lift, and it's something that rides occasionally don't do, and they get stuck at the base. B&M likes to put wheels at the lift base. A lot of manufacturers do. They put wheels down there, and they like to feed the train on at a certain speed. That way it always comes in and latches on at the exact same angle, exact same speed. The train and the chain essentially match the speed as they're going up. Along that same lines of making the lift, the sprockets are mounted down very low in that area as well. because they don't want the chain dog to hit the sprocket. So that's why typically the sprockets are mounted down outside of the track area, so the chain dog doesn't hit that. It's got free, clear chain to latch onto as it goes. Old wooden roller coasters along those lines also did, it's not a great thing, but they would also put that head sprocket, how I was saying like B&M does theirs much further down the lift or away from the lift. Old Woodies used to put that head sprocket right up there at the very top, right as it started to crown over. And what you would get sometimes is that if you had a train that was loaded heavy in the back and it was struggling really hard to come up that lift hill, what you would get is a lot of times on that front chain dog, it would still be latched in as it passed by that bull wheel, or as it passed by the head sprocket. And a lot of times it would bite the chain dog and it would cause wear on the chain dog prematurely. So a lot of times it wasn't that way, but sometimes it was. It would bite in and grab that thing. Okay, I think that's going to do it for me. I think I've made this video a lot longer than it needed to be, but I think that's just the way it is. All right, I'm Ryan the Ride Mechanic. As always, stay off the air gates. Bye.